The air in the mountains had a way of getting into your head. Thin, dry, and cold enough to make your lungs ache with every breath. It clung to you, tight, making everything seem sharper, louder, like the world around you was just waiting to snap. That's how it felt the day we found the temple. Or rather, the day the temple found us. I remember the moment we stumbled upon it. We weren't supposed to be in that part of the mountains, but something had drawn us there. Maybe it was a gut feeling, maybe just the exhaustion of weeks in hostile territory. But when the rocks gave way to that hidden entrance, there was no mistaking the weight of it. Ancient stone, half buried, hidden beneath layers of dust and time. The kind of thing that should have stayed forgotten. "Spence, you seeing this?" Carter, one of my best guys, stood just behind me, his voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't have to say more. I saw it. We all did. There was something wrong about the place. I've been through hell and back, seen enough to make most men crack, but that temple, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was like walking into a tomb that had been waiting for us. I motioned for the team to move forward, slow and careful. Every step echoed, bouncing off the stone walls as if the place had never heard a human footstep before. The deeper we went, the colder it got. And it wasn't the normal kind of cold, either. This was different, like the air itself was turning hostile. I gripped my rifle tighter, even though I had no idea what I expected to find. Just instinct, I guess. Inside, it was worse. The smell hit us first, stale, rotting, like the earth itself had soured. And then there were the carvings, thousands of symbols etched into the walls, circling the ceiling, some smeared with what looked like dried blood. "Jesus," one of the guys muttered under his breath. No one argued. There wasn't much to say when faced with something that felt so wrong, so utterly beyond what we were used to. I found the first artifact near the center. It was a small stone tablet, covered in the same symbols, except these had a different feel to them, almost like they were vibrating. My fingers brushed against it, and a shiver ran through my spine. I didn't say anything to the others, but I could feel it, something shifting in the air around us. As I looked up, I saw the same unease on their faces. We all knew it, without having to say a word. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just some ancient ruin. We stood there for what felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. Time didn't make sense in that place. The air was too still, too thick, as if it was watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. My hand was still hovering over that tablet, every nerve in my body screaming at me to drop it and get the hell out of there. But I didn't. Something about the symbols kept pulling me in, like they were whispering, tugging at the edges of my mind. "Spence, we need to go." Carter's voice cut through the silence. He sounded shaken, and that wasn't like him. The guy had nerves of steel. He'd been with me in firefights, in places where death was as common as the dust in the air. But here, in this temple, something had him rattled. It had all of us rattled. The others were shifting uneasily, hands twitching near their weapons, eyes darting around like they expected something to come crawling out of the shadows. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah, let's get back to base. We'll figure out what this is later." But even as I said it, I knew there wouldn't be any simple explanation. This wasn't something that could be debriefed over a cup of coffee in some war room. There was something ancient here, something we weren't meant to find. And now that we had, I wasn't sure we'd be able to leave it behind. We moved as fast as we could without breaking into a run, the weight of the temple pressing down on us with every step. The air got heavier the closer we got to the entrance, like the walls were closing in. I could hear the others breathing, quick and shallow, matching my own pulse pounding in my ears. When we finally stepped out into the open, it felt like the world had shifted. The sky above us was darker than it should have been, the wind colder, and the mountains that had once been just a backdrop now loomed like silent sentinels, watching our every move. Carter turned to me, his face pale. "What the hell was that, Spence?" His voice was low, like he didn't want the mountains to hear him. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We were trained to deal with the tangible, the physical, not this. I glanced back at the temple entrance, half hidden by rock and shadow, and felt a chill crawl up my spine. Something was still in there, and it wasn't done with us. We radioed back to base as we started our descent, but the signal was weak, cutting in and out like the air itself was messing with the equipment. "We need to get this intel to command," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. But in the back of my mind, I was already wondering if command would even believe us. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed us. We made our way down the mountain in silence. No one wanted to talk about what we'd seen in that temple. The sun was setting, but it wasn't the kind of sunset that brought any peace. The sky had a sickly, pale hue, casting long shadows over the rocks, stretching out like they were reaching for us. Every crunch of gravel underfoot felt too loud, too real, and yet somehow distant, like we weren't entirely here anymore. Like a part of us was still back in that place, left behind with those carvings and whatever was buried beneath them. Carter kept glancing over his shoulder, and I could see the tension in his jaw. It wasn't just nerves, it was fear. I felt it too, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The kind of fear you don't shake off easily, the kind that settles deep inside and makes you question everything you think you know. I kept telling myself we were trained for this, that fear was part of the job, but this was different. This wasn't the fear of bullets or bombs. This was something older, something that didn't care about tactics or firepower. "Did you feel it, Spence?" Carter finally broke the silence. His voice was low, barely more than a whisper. He didn't need to explain what he meant. I knew. The weight in that temple, the way the air pressed in like it was alive, like it had been waiting for us to stumble in and wake it up. I hadn't wanted to acknowledge it, but now, hearing it spoken out loud, it was impossible to ignore. "Yeah," I said, keeping my eyes on the path ahead. I felt it. And I still did. It lingered, that sensation of being watched, of something crawling under my skin. I tried to push it down, tried to focus on the mission, but it was like a splinter in my mind, impossible to pull out. When we finally reached the base of the mountain, the hum of the chopper waiting for us should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The closer we got, the more it felt like the ground beneath us was shifting. The air had a strange density to it, like it was holding its breath. I could see the rest of the team felt it too. Every step was slower, more hesitant, like we were all waiting for something to happen, something to snap. As we approached the bird, I spotted the pilot, Thompson, leaning against the side of the chopper, arms crossed. But something about the way he stood didn't sit right. It took me a second to realize what was wrong. He wasn't moving. Not at all. Just standing there, too still, his face hidden in the fading light. "Thompson?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. No response. Carter shot me a look, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. We closed the distance, and that's when I saw it. His eyes. They were wide open, staring straight ahead, but there was nothing there. No recognition, no life. He wasn't breathing. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Jesus," Carter muttered beside me, taking a step back. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. No signs of a struggle, no wounds, just gone. 1 second he was waiting for us. The next, it was like the life had been sucked out of him. My gut twisted, that splinter of fear digging deeper. Whatever we'd uncovered up there, it hadn't stayed behind. It was with us now. And it wasn't finished. The moment we realized Thompson was dead, something shifted in the air. It was like the ground had dropped out from under us. The familiar weight of the mission, adrenaline, calculation, focus, was gone, replaced by something darker, something we weren't trained for. The look on Carter's face said it all. He was as rattled as I was, and that scared me more than anything. Carter was the guy who didn't flinch when bullets flew, but this was different. I knelt beside Thompson, reaching out cautiously to check his pulse, even though I knew what I'd find. His skin was cold, almost like he'd been gone for hours. But that didn't make sense. We'd been in the temple less than 2, and he was fine when we'd left. The thought hit me hard. Whatever had done this, it wasn't something we could fight. This wasn't an enemy you could see or shoot. Carter crouched next to me, his voice low. "Spence, what the hell's going on?" His eyes darted around, never resting on any one spot for too long, as if he expected something to come crawling out of the shadows. I didn't have an answer for him. My mind was racing, trying to put the pieces together, but none of it fit. The temple, the symbols, Thompson. It was like we were caught in the middle of a nightmare that didn't follow any rules. I stood up, scanning the ridge behind us. The sun had almost set, and the darkness was creeping in fast. We needed to move, but the thought of getting on that chopper with Thompson's lifeless body felt like stepping into a tomb. Carter stood too, brushing dirt from his pants, his eyes fixed on Thompson. "We have to report this. Command needs to know." "Report what?" I snapped, more out of frustration than anger. "We don't even know what this is. You think they'll believe us? That Thompson just died? Like that?" I gestured at his body, the stillness of it, the emptiness. Carter didn't respond. He didn't have to. He knew I was right. No one would believe us. Hell, I didn't believe us. The wind picked up, howling through the mountains, and I could swear I heard something in it, like a whisper, faint but there, threading through the gusts. My pulse quickened, and I shot a glance at Carter, wondering if he'd heard it too. His jaw tightened, eyes scanning the horizon, but he said nothing. Maybe he didn't hear it. Maybe it was just in my head. But then, maybe none of this was just in my head. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I didn't bother trying to explain the dread crawling up my spine, the sense that something was watching us from the dark. Carter nodded, already moving toward the chopper, his hand on his weapon. The others were quiet, too quiet, and I could feel the weight of their fear hanging in the air. As we lifted off, the mountains shrank beneath us, but that feeling of being watched didn't go away. It stayed with me, growing heavier the farther we flew. I glanced at Thompson's body strapped in the back, and for a split second, I thought I saw his lips twitch. I blinked, my heart pounding, but when I looked again, he was still. The rational part of my mind told me it was nothing, just my nerves, but something deeper told me I wasn't imagining it. Whatever had touched Thompson, whatever had killed him, wasn't finished with us yet. As we flew further from the mountains, the silence in the chopper felt suffocating. The rotors hummed, but beneath that, there was an absence, a void where conversation should have been. No one spoke. No one dared. I kept glancing at Thompson's body, strapped in tight, his face frozen in that blank stare. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't really gone, not in the way people usually are. Carter sat across from me, his eyes fixed on the ground outside the window, but I knew he wasn't looking at the landscape. He was lost somewhere in his own head, probably replaying the day over and over like I was, trying to make sense of the senseless. The rest of the team, they looked just as rattled, their faces pale, jaws tight. This wasn't what we signed up for. War? We could handle that. Death? We'd made peace with it a long time ago. But this was something else. I couldn't help but think back to the moment in the temple. The way the air felt heavier, charged, like it was alive. The carvings on the wall, the symbols that seemed to move when you weren't looking. I'd touched one of the artifacts, just for a second, but long enough to feel something. A shift, a pull. I hadn't said anything at the time, because what would I have said? That the stone felt like it was pulsing? That it had recognized me? It sounded insane, but now, sitting here with Thompson's cold body and the creeping dread gnawing at me, I wasn't so sure anymore. Out of nowhere, the lights in the chopper flickered, just once, then twice, before going steady again. My stomach lurched, that primal fear tightening its grip on my throat. I glanced at Carter, hoping for some reassurance, but his expression was blank, his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle like a lifeline. That's when I heard it. A whisper, soft but unmistakable, coming from the back of the chopper. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head, every instinct telling me not to look, not to acknowledge it. But I had to. Thompson's body lay there, still as stone, except his lips. His lips were moving, just barely, as if they were struggling to form words. I couldn't hear what he was saying. I didn't want to hear it, but the whisper kept coming, rising just enough to crawl into my ears, even over the sound of the rotors. "Spence?" Carter's voice was hoarse, barely more than a breath. He'd seen it too. The rest of the team was frozen, their eyes locked on Thompson. No one moved. No one dared. The air inside the chopper had turned icy, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and doesn't let go. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Thompson's lips stilled, his face returning to that empty stare. The whispering was gone, but the weight of it lingered, pressing down on all of us. I wanted to scream, to shout that this wasn't real, that we were losing our minds, but deep down I knew it was. Whatever we had touched in that temple, whatever had touched us, wasn't going to let go. Not ever. We landed at base hours later, but I knew, we all knew, that whatever followed us out of that temple hadn't stayed behind in those mountains. It was with us now, woven into our lives like a shadow, lurking in the corners of our minds. And the worst part? I could still feel it. That pull, that recognition, like something had marked me, claimed me. I came back to New Jersey, hoping the quiet would help. After years of chaos, the silence of the Pine Barrens seemed like a blessing. It didn't take long to realize I was wrong. The stillness wasn't peace. It was something else, something I couldn't put into words. My first night in the cabin was restless. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling that the woods were watching me. It was ridiculous, of course. I'd been in places where real danger lurked, places where a mistake could get you killed. But this was different. There was no enemy here, just trees and dirt and shadows that stretched out for miles. Or so I thought. The first strange thing happened 3 days after I arrived. I was walking along a trail that snaked deeper into the barrens when I saw something lying on the path ahead. It was a dead deer, or at least what was left of it. The body had been torn apart, like something wild had gotten to it. I crouched down, inspecting the wounds. They were jagged, messy, almost human. It didn't make sense. No animal would leave something like that behind. My heart started racing, the familiar feeling of danger creeping up my spine, but there was no sound, no sign of anything, just that carcass, rotting under the sun. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. It started as a faint rustling outside the window, like someone or something was moving around out there. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a raccoon, but the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. A soft knock against the walls, a creak on the porch. It was nothing, I told myself. I was jumping at shadows. But when I finally worked up the nerve to peek out the window, there was nothing. Just the dark trees, standing still. The next morning, I went into town. The diner was half empty, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. I could feel their eyes on me as I sat down. A waitress came over, her smile tight. "You're the one staying out by the Barrens, aren't you?" she asked, pouring my coffee without waiting for an answer. "Yeah, just trying to get some space," I said, hoping to shut down the conversation. But she didn't move. "You know about the kids, right? The ones that went missing?" Her voice dropped, like she wasn't supposed to be talking about it. I looked up, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the kind of fear you get from watching too many horror movies. It was real, lived in, the kind you don't shake off. I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. "I've heard some rumors. They say the woods take them," she whispered, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "People see things out there, things that don't make sense." I didn't know how to respond, so I just thanked her and left. But her words stuck with me, twisting in my mind. That night, I tried to brush it off, but sleep didn't come. Instead, the sounds came back, louder this time. Something scraped against the door, slow and deliberate, like it was testing the wood. I lay still, my breath caught in my throat, heart pounding in my chest. Then a low, guttural whisper, too soft to make out, but close, so close I could feel it in my bones. I bolted out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. The door was still locked, the windows shut tight, but the whisper lingered, crawling under my skin like it had followed me inside. The next morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. Every muscle in my body was tense, my mind fogged with exhaustion. I kept thinking about the noises from the night before, the way they seemed so real, so deliberate. I told myself it had to be animals, maybe a branch scraping against the cabin, but deep down, I wasn't buying it. Something had been there. I could feel it. I decided to head back into the woods, though I'm not sure why. Maybe it was pride, or maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a knife, I retraced my steps along the trail. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I saw it again. The symbols. They were carved into a cluster of trees, etched deep into the bark like someone or something had taken their time. The patterns weren't random. They had a shape, a rhythm, almost like a language. I reached out to touch one of the carvings, my fingers tracing the rough edges. The wood was cold, colder than it should have been in the middle of the day. I jerked my hand back, startled by a noise behind me. At first, I thought it was footsteps, but they were too slow, too heavy. I turned, scanning the woods, my heart racing in my chest. Who's there? My voice sounded weaker than I wanted it to, the question hanging in the air with no response. I stood there for a minute, maybe longer, waiting for something, anything, to show itself. But nothing did. On the way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often I'd hear something, a snap of a twig, a rustle in the leaves, but when I'd look, there was nothing. My mind was starting to go places I didn't want it to. Old instincts kicked in, telling me to keep moving, to not look back, but I kept glancing over my shoulder anyway. Every time I did, the trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was almost dusk. The light was fading fast, and the sense of being watched had grown stronger. I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight, though I wasn't sure what I was even trying to keep out. I sat there for a while, staring at the window, waiting for the noises to start again. But they didn't. Instead, it was the silence that got to me. It was thick, oppressive, like the forest was pressing up against the walls, trying to get inside. Then there was a knock. I froze. The knock was soft, almost polite, but it was enough to send a wave of dread through me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There was no way anyone could have followed me. No one else had been in the woods. I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to happen again. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a second knock, more insistent this time. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Who's there?" I called out. But my voice didn't sound like mine. It was shaky, unsure. No answer. I reached for the handle, but my hand stopped just before touching it. Something about this wasn't right. This wasn't someone lost or looking for help. I stepped back, the air in the cabin suddenly feeling too thick. My mind kept going over the possibilities. A prank? A local kid messing around? But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was wrong here. The knocks came again, faster, louder. Whoever, or whatever was out there, wasn't going to wait much longer. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, pointing the beam at the door, like that would somehow give me more control. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Another knock, and then silence. No footsteps walking away, no sounds of someone retreating into the woods, just the oppressive quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. I crept closer to the door, my breath shallow. Through the small window at the top, I could barely make out the trees swaying in the wind. Nothing else. No movement. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening, but there was nothing until there was. A low whisper, faint but clear, snaked its way through the crack beneath the door. My whole body went cold. It wasn't words. It was more like a sound, like something mimicking the cadence of speech, trying to be human but not quite getting it right. Backing away, I stumbled into the table, knocking over a glass that shattered on the floor. I didn't care. I couldn't stay there anymore. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood frozen, flashlight gripped tightly, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any second. The whispering continued, growing fainter, fading into a murmur before disappearing entirely. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally gathered the nerve to open the door, there was nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone ever being there. Just the quiet night and the thick, oppressive darkness stretching out beyond the porch. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. I slammed the door shut, locking it twice this time. But as I sat there in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been knocking wasn't done with me. Not yet. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the knock, feel the pressure of whatever was out there pushing against the walls of the cabin. My mind was a mess, running in circles trying to make sense of it. But how do you explain something that doesn't follow the rules? I couldn't. Every logical thought I tried to cling to slipped away. replaced by this gnawing sense of dread. By the time dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. The sunlight didn't bring any comfort. If anything, it made things worse. The daylight felt like a lie, as if everything that had happened in the dark was still waiting just beyond the trees, hiding, waiting for night to fall again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, had been watching me since I first set foot in the Barrens, maybe longer. I decided to leave the cabin for a while. I needed to clear my head, needed to be around people, anything to get away from the suffocating silence. I drove into town, but even there, I couldn't escape it. The streets were too quiet, the people too distant. It felt like the whole place was on edge, like everyone knew something they weren't telling me. When I walked into the diner, the same waitress from before glanced at me, but this time, her smile was gone. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she muttered, almost under her breath. I wanted to laugh, but the sound died in my throat. "I think something's out there," I said, voice low, hoping no one else would hear. She froze for a second, then leaned in, her face hardening. "You should leave," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder. "This place, it doesn't let people go easily once it gets a hold of them." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't joking. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sense of superstition, just cold, hard certainty. "Why doesn't anyone do anything?" I asked, frustration slipping into my tone. "People have gone missing. This isn't just in my head." She shook her head, her eyes darting around like she was afraid someone might overhear. "People have tried, believe me, but whatever it is, it's old. It doesn't play by our rules. You can't fight it." She looked at me, her voice lowering even more. "You can only survive it if it lets you." That was the moment I realized how far and over my head I was. Whatever I'd stepped into, it wasn't just some folklore or superstition. It was real, and it was bigger than me, bigger than the town. My stomach twisted with a sick feeling. I left the diner without another word, her warning echoing in my head. Back at the cabin, the silence felt even heavier, like the woods had been waiting for me to return. I stood in the doorway for a long time, debating whether to even go inside. Part of me wanted to just leave, drive until I hit the highway and never look back. But another part knew that I couldn't run from this. It was already too late for that. I stood in the doorway for what felt like hours, my hand hovering over the knob. The air inside the cabin felt thick, oppressive, like stepping into a room where someone had been holding their breath for too long. I didn't want to be here, but I knew leaving wouldn't fix anything. The thing in the woods, whatever it was, had already marked me. It had let me go last night, but that wasn't the end. It was playing with me. And deep down, I knew it was just a matter of time before it came back. I locked the door behind me, though it didn't feel like enough. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop thinking about what the waitress had said. "You can only survive it, if it lets you." Was that all I was doing now? Surviving? I sat in the corner of the room, my back against the wall, flashlight clutched in my hand. The sun was sinking fast outside, and with it, my sense of safety was slipping away. The minutes dragged on. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was still reeling from everything I'd seen. But the air had changed again. I could feel it. The same heaviness from last night, the same presence pushing in from the dark. Then it started. The knocking. Slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. The sound echoed through the cabin, crawling into my bones. My hands were shaking now, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The knock came again, louder this time. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I stayed where I was. I wasn't going to open that door, not this time. But then I heard it. The voice. Soft, almost familiar. It called my name. Not in the way someone would call out for help, but in a way that made my blood run cold. It was like it was trying to sound like me, a distorted echo of my own voice. "Jake, come outside." I stared at the door, breath caught in my throat. Through the gap, I saw something move, something dark and shifting, like smoke taking shape. It didn't have a face, but I knew what it was. I knew it had been waiting for this moment, for me to break. And in that second, I realized the horrible truth. This thing wasn't here to kill me. It wanted something worse. It wanted to become me. When I first heard about Willow Creek Mansion, it was just another case file, another abandoned house with a tragic past. But something about it pulled me in. Maybe it was the way the officers described it, unsolvable, haunted, or maybe I was just looking for a distraction from everything else. Either way, I found myself driving down the narrow, winding roads of Ohio, my mind racing with unanswered questions. The moment the mansion came into view, a chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off. I've seen worse. Crime scenes that would haunt anyone else for a lifetime. But this place, there was something different. The windows, dark and broken, stared back at me like empty eyes. The air felt heavy, like the house itself was waiting, watching. I parked the car and stepped out, my boots sinking into the overgrown grass as I approached the entrance. "Scarlett, you've dealt with worse," I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself. My hand hovered over the door handle for a moment before I finally pushed it open. The door creaked, and I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, damp, like rotting wood and stale air. The kind of scent that gets under your skin, makes you feel like you need to get out, but I stayed. I had to. The silence inside was almost unbearable. Every step I took echoed down the long, empty hallways, and the floor beneath me groaned as if protesting my presence. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and dust-covered furniture. Whoever lived here once left in a hurry. But why? And why has no one been able to solve the murders? I'd heard the stories, the legends about the place, but I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or curses. Not yet. I paused in front of a cracked mirror in the hallway, catching my reflection. For a moment, I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. The lines around my eyes looked deeper, my face more worn than I remembered. 8 years on the force in Chicago will do that to you. But it was more than that. This place was already getting under my skin, and I hadn't even begun the real investigation. "Focus," I whispered, shaking my head. But as I turned to leave the hallway, I heard it. A faint sound. Not a creak, not the wind, but something else. A voice, maybe? I froze, straining to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it came. My heart raced, but I forced myself to move forward, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew. This house had a story to tell, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. I moved deeper into the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, biting at my skin even though it was the middle of summer. My flashlight flickered briefly, and I cursed under my breath. Great, just what I needed, a dying light in a place like this. I gave it a hard tap, and the beam steadied. For now. The hallway branched off into several rooms, each one darker and more uninviting than the next. I chose the door on the left, an old wooden one that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. As I pushed it open, the hinges let out a low groan, like the house itself was protesting my presence. Inside, the room was small, almost claustrophobic. Dust covered everything, thick enough that I could write my name in it if I wanted to. An old bed sat in the corner, its sheets still rumpled, like someone had just gotten up and left. Something about that made my skin crawl. I scanned the room for anything unusual, but it was just the same decaying mess as the rest of the house. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd been in enough dangerous situations to trust my instincts, and they were screaming at me now. My eyes caught on a small nightstand by the bed. A faded photograph rested on top, the edges yellowed with age. I stepped closer, wiping off the dust to get a better look. It was a family, 2 parents and a young boy, smiling in front of the very house I was standing in. They looked happy, normal, but something in their eyes, I don't know. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but there was a sadness there, something that didn't belong in a picture like this. Who were they? And more importantly, what happened to them? "All right, Anderson, you're losing it," I muttered, placing the photo back down. I needed to stay focused, keep my head clear. But this place, it was like it was feeding off my thoughts, twisting them, making me question everything. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of light felt like a warning, a reminder that I wasn't welcome here. I was about to leave the room when I heard it again. That sound. This time, it was clearer. Not just a voice, but words. Faint, almost too soft to make out. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. "Help me." The voice was distant, like it was coming from far away, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't my imagination. My heart pounded in my chest. I should have run, left the house right then and there. But instead, I found myself moving toward the source of the sound, like I was being pulled. I stepped back into the hallway, the voice growing a little louder with each step. "Help me." It echoed through the walls, faint but insistent. I couldn't tell if it was a plea or a trap. I clenched my flashlight tighter and followed the voice deeper into the mansion. I knew it was a bad idea, but something was driving me forward. Something I couldn't explain. The hallway twisted and turned, each corner darker than the last. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing peeling wallpaper and the occasional spider web. I tried to ignore the creeping feeling that the walls were closing in on me. The voice I'd heard earlier grew louder, more insistent. "Help me," it whispered, and I couldn't tell if it was getting closer or if I was just getting more desperate to find its source. As I moved forward, the temperature seemed to drop. My breath turned into fog in front of me, and I shivered despite my efforts to stay calm. I rounded a corner and found myself in what looked like a library. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with old, dusty books. A heavy, musty smell filled the air, almost like a damp blanket draped over my face. I walked to the center of the room, trying to make sense of the noise. "Okay, Scarlett, think," I said aloud, trying to steady my nerves. "You're here to investigate. Don't let some creepy sounds spook you." But even as I spoke, my voice felt hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the mansion. I glanced at the rows of books, some of which had fallen to the floor. I picked up one with a cracked spine and leafed through it, though the contents were too faded to read. A sudden movement caught my eye. I froze, staring at the shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or something more. Then I saw it, a book lying open on a table in the center of the room. The pages were yellowed, and the cover was too grimy to make out. But it looked out of place, like it had been deliberately left there for me to find. I approached the table, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. The book's pages were filled with handwritten notes, sketches of the mansion, and strange symbols. As I flipped through, I realized the sketches depicted scenes of violence, people in chains, dark figures, and symbols that made my skin crawl. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A sudden crash from somewhere deeper in the house made me jump. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest. "Damn it, Scarlett. Get a grip," I muttered, but I knew the rational part of my mind was slipping away. I had to investigate the noise, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took a deep breath and moved toward the source of the sound. The voice, now almost a desperate scream, guided me forward. Every step felt like a step closer to something I couldn't comprehend. The mansion seemed to be alive, its dark corners hiding secrets that I was determined to uncover. But with every step, I felt the weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing in on me, making me question whether I was truly prepared for what lay ahead. The noise came again, louder this time, a thud, then a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My pulse quickened, and I moved cautiously toward the noise, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The mansion seemed to stretch and distort, the walls seeming to close in around me as I followed the sound. Each creak and groan of the house added to my mounting unease. I reached a door at the end of a narrow corridor, its surface marred with scratches and deep grooves. The door frame was splintered, as if someone or something had tried to break out. I hesitated, my hand resting on the doorknob. "Don't be stupid, Scarlett. Just open it," I told myself, but the hesitation was there, gnawing at my resolve. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a darkened basement, cluttered with old furniture and broken objects. The stench of mildew and decay was overpowering. As my flashlight beam swept over the room, it landed on an old, tattered armchair in the center. The chair was covered in a thick layer of dust, but something about it made my skin crawl. It felt like an unsettling centerpiece, as though it were waiting for someone or something to sit in it. Suddenly, I heard it again, that same scraping sound. This time, it was coming from behind a large, dusty curtain in the far corner. I approached the curtain slowly, every step echoing in the empty room. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached for the fabric. With a trembling hand, I pulled it aside. The sight that met me was both fascinating and horrifying. Behind the curtain was a wall covered in strange symbols and crude drawings. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy that made my head spin. In the center of the wall was a crude drawing of a figure bound in chains, surrounded by more of those unsettling symbols. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. The symbols looked almost alive, as if they were shifting and changing before my eyes. "God, what is this?" I whispered, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I could almost hear the whispers of the past, the voices of the people who had been trapped in this place. The fear was becoming palpable, crawling up my spine and making it hard to think straight. I turned away from the wall, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The chair seemed to loom larger in my vision, and I noticed a small, glistening object on the floor near it. As I bent down to pick it up, I realized it was a small locket, its surface tarnished, but still intact. I opened it, revealing a faded photograph of the same family I had seen earlier, the parents and the boy. But this time, the boy's face was scratched out, and underneath was scrawled the word, "Help," in what looked like red ink. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts. I needed to get out, but the mansion seemed to conspire against me. The corridors felt like a maze, and the fear of being lost and alone began to set in. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I had to keep moving, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The mansion was alive with its secrets, and I was more deeply ensnared than ever before. The tension in the mansion had reached a fever pitch. My mind raced as I clutched the locket, my flashlight flickering intermittently. I needed to find a way out, but the house seemed to conspire against me, each hallway twisting into a maze. I stumbled back into the library, desperate for some sense of normalcy, but the sight that greeted me made my stomach churn. The books on the floor had shifted, their pages now splayed open to the symbols and sketches I had seen earlier. It was as if they were trying to communicate something to me, their messages growing more frantic. My flashlight beam caught a new detail, a handprint smeared in what looked like dried blood on one of the pages. I felt my throat tighten as I realized this was no ordinary case. "Okay, Scarlet, calm down," I whispered to myself, though my voice trembled. "Think this through." But my mind was anything but clear. The house seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, a palpable sense of malevolence that made every shadow seem alive. I knew I was close to uncovering something significant, but what? And at what cost? I turned my attention back to the book on the table, hoping to find some clue. As I leafed through the pages, I noticed a loose sheet of paper wedged between them. I pulled it out, and my heart sank. It was a letter, written in a shaky hand. If you're reading this, it means the cycle is about to begin again. The house feeds on the lost and the damned. There's no escaping it once it has chosen you. The ritual must be completed to free the trapped souls. Find the hidden chamber beneath the house. It is there that you will find the truth and the means to end it. The letter fell from my hands, and I stared at the floor in shock. "A hidden chamber?" I muttered, trying to process what I'd just read. The idea of a ritual, of souls trapped in the mansion, was almost too much to grasp, but the letter was clear. I needed to find this chamber, or risk becoming another lost soul. I set out with renewed urgency, following the vague directions given in the letter. The mansion seemed to shift around me, the walls narrowing and the air growing colder. My flashlight caught a glimpse of a narrow, hidden door behind a bookcase. My heart raced as I pried it open, revealing a dark stairwell leading down into the bowels of the house. I descended the stairs, each step echoing ominously. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating. At the bottom, I found a small room, its walls covered in the same disturbing symbols from earlier. In the center of the room was a stone altar, and on it, an old, rusted knife. The sight made my stomach turn. This was where the rituals had taken place. But the real horror came when I looked up. The walls were covered in photographs, faces of people who had disappeared over the years, and among them was a recent photo of me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The house had been watching me, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. The cycle wasn't just about trapping souls, It was about feeding off those who came seeking answers. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I had to get out, but the fear of being trapped was overwhelming. As I turned to leave, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. The house had me. The cycle was complete. It felt like the perfect escape. After years in the Navy, the thought of solitude at a lighthouse in Cape Cod seemed almost peaceful. I guess I was wrong. The place was more isolated than I'd imagined. The lighthouse towered over the edge of a jagged cliff, waves crashing violently against the rocks below. The wind never stopped howling, day or night. When I arrived, the locals didn't say much, just a few words of warning that I brushed off as superstitions. "It gets lonely out there," one man had said. "Strange things happen in the winter." I just nodded, figuring they were trying to spook the outsider. But as I drove away from town, the hairs on my neck stood up like I was leaving something behind, something important. The first week was uneventful. I spent my days fixing up the old place, making sure the generator ran smoothly, keeping the light operational. At night, I'd sit on the porch, staring at the horizon, listening to the ocean's rhythm. The wind sounded different here. It wasn't just a gust through the cracks of the windows, it almost had a voice. I could swear it whispered my name a few times, but I shook it off. "You're just hearing things," I'd mutter to myself, gripping the arms of my chair a little tighter. Then, things started to change. It wasn't the wind anymore. Doors would close on their own, little things would be out of place, and I'd hear faint footsteps coming from upstairs when I knew no one else was around. At first, I thought maybe the old building was settling, or the storm outside was playing tricks on me. I tried to ignore it, focus on my tasks, keep my mind occupied. But every night, as darkness swallowed the landscape, the atmosphere inside the lighthouse became oppressive, like the walls were closing in. One night, after checking the light, I heard a soft knock. My heart stopped for a second. I stood frozen, staring at the door. No one was supposed to be out here. Slowly, I walked over, opened it. Nothing. Just the wind, cold and biting. But I swear I saw something in the distance, just past the edge of the light's reach. A figure, maybe a man, standing still, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. "You're losing it, Ryan," I whispered, feeling the sweat on my palms. I didn't sleep that night. My mind wouldn't stop racing. Who would be out here? The nearest town was miles away. I replayed the moment over and over, but the more I thought about it, the more unsure I became. Had I actually seen anything, or was the isolation getting to me? Either way, I felt watched. Every creak of the old wood beneath my feet, every gust of wind against the windows felt like a presence. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to reveal itself. By the time dawn broke, I knew I wasn't alone. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to me like a shadow. The lighthouse felt different, heavier somehow. The light from outside barely touched the inside of the place, leaving long, dark corners where my mind played tricks on me. I went through the motions, checked the oil in the generator, cleaned the lenses, but I couldn't stop thinking about that figure, or whatever it was. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see it again, standing there, watching. By midday, the wind picked up, fierce and relentless, howling through every crack. I tried to focus, but there was this constant pressure in the air, like something was waiting. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. It wasn't just the wind that unnerved me anymore. There was something else, something I couldn't put into words. Every now and then, I'd hear it, soft, distant sounds, like footsteps moving just out of sight, or a faint murmur from the stairwell. I knew it wasn't real. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Around dusk, I decided to take a walk along the cliff. Maybe fresh air would clear my head. The wind hit hard, almost knocking me off balance. I shoved my hands into my jacket and started pacing the edge, looking out over the water. The ocean stretched endlessly, dark and unforgiving, waves crashing against the rocks with a force that shook the ground beneath me. For a moment, I thought about leaving. "Just pack up and go, Ryan," I muttered to myself. "Nobody would blame you." But something kept me here. Curiosity? Pride? I didn't know. All I knew was that whatever was happening, I wasn't ready to run yet. That night, the noises got worse. I was in the kitchen, boiling water for coffee, when I heard it again, footsteps coming from upstairs, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing just above me. I froze, staring at the ceiling, waiting for them to stop, but they didn't. They kept going, back and forth, until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling, and headed up the stairs. "There's no one here," I whispered, trying to steady my breathing. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing in the stillness. When I reached the top, the air felt colder, almost freezing. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, scanning the narrow hallway. Empty. The door to the keeper's room at the end was slightly ajar, but I hadn't touched it. "Hello?" My voice came out weak, barely audible over the wind outside. No response. I swallowed hard, moving slowly toward the door. My fingers brushed the handle, and I pushed it open, shining the light inside. Nothing. Just the empty room, same as I'd left it. But the feeling was there, something unseen, just out of reach. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me, and stood in the hallway for a long time, trying to convince myself I hadn't heard anything. But I knew better. Something was in that lighthouse with me, and it wasn't going away. The cold crept deeper into the walls, settling into my bones. I couldn't shake it, no matter how many layers I piled on or how close I sat to the old heater in the corner. Every time I glanced out the window, the world seemed darker than the night before, like the lighthouse was sinking into some endless void. The light that used to guide ships now felt like a thin line between me and whatever was lurking just beyond its reach. That night, the wind was louder than ever, almost violent. It rattled the windows, howled through the cracks in the door, but I could swear I heard something else underneath it, something deliberate, like a low hum, a voice just out of range. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, but it was getting harder to believe that. I hadn't slept in days, not properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear those footsteps again, circling the rooms above me. Sometimes I'd hear them right outside my door. I was losing it. I knew that. But what was I supposed to do? Pack up and leave like some scared kid? "You're not crazy," I whispered to myself, staring into the cup of coffee cooling on the table in front of me. "You're not imagining this." But even as I said it, doubt crept in. I hadn't seen anything, not clearly anyway, just sounds and flickers of movement. Was my mind filling in the gaps, or was something really in this place, watching, waiting? At around midnight, I heard a knock. It wasn't the wind this time. I knew that sound by now. This was different, sharp, purposeful. My heart stopped for a second, then started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. No one should be out here. Not at this hour. Not in this weather. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky, barely cutting through the noise outside. Nothing. Silence. I walked over to the door, every instinct telling me not to open it, but my hand was already on the knob. Slowly, I pulled it open. The wind hit me hard, but there was no one there. Just the endless dark stretching out to the ocean. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure. This time it was closer, standing right at the edge of the cliff, unmoving, facing the lighthouse. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and it was gone. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and backed away. "This isn't real," I muttered, gripping the back of a chair for support. But I knew it was. Whatever I saw, it was real, and it was getting closer. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in on me. Every corner of the lighthouse seemed darker now, every sound more sinister. The isolation, the quiet I once craved, it was suffocating me. Something wanted me to crack, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. The next few days blurred together. I barely left the main room. Sleep came in short bursts, and every time I drifted off, I'd wake up in a panic, sure I'd heard something creeping around. The figure at the cliff haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it, standing there, staring back at me. I tried convincing myself it was just the isolation messing with my head, but deep down, I knew it was something more. Something I couldn't explain. On the third night, the knocking returned. Louder this time, more insistent. My stomach twisted as I stared at the door, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. Instead, it got closer, moving from the front door to the walls, like someone or something was circling the lighthouse, testing every entry. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight, and slowly walked toward the sound. My legs felt heavy, each step harder than the last. "Just a storm," I muttered. "It's the wind." But I didn't believe that anymore. When I reached the door, the knocking had stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I pressed my ear against the wood, heart pounding, listening for any hint of movement. Nothing. The wind outside had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and pulled it open a crack, shining the light outside. The beam barely cut through the darkness, but I could make out the empty path leading to the cliff's edge. Empty. No figure, no footsteps, just the endless night and the sound of the ocean crashing far below. But as I turned to close the door, something caught my eye, a faint outline in the fog, just beyond the path. A shape, human-like, standing in the mist, barely visible. My heart raced. I stepped outside, flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" My voice sounded too small, too fragile. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I took another step, but my legs wouldn't carry me any farther. Something about it was all wrong. Its stillness, it wasn't natural. It was like staring at a statue, frozen in place, yet I could feel its attention on me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I backed up, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to get inside. I slammed the door and locked it, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. "Get a grip, Ryan," I whispered, pressing my back against the door. But I couldn't calm down. I couldn't stop shaking. Something was out there. Something I didn't understand, and it was getting closer. The isolation that once felt like freedom now felt like a prison. I was trapped in here, with whatever was outside, and there was no one coming to help. As I sat there, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from above. Slow, deliberate, just like before. Only this time, they didn't stop. They moved steadily, circling the room, as if something was walking just overhead. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere safe. And for the first time, I realized that whatever was haunting this place wasn't just outside anymore. It was in here with me. I don't know how long I stood there, pressed against the door, waiting for something to happen. My heart was racing, every muscle in my body tense, like I was bracing for an impact. The footsteps above me, God, they were deliberate, almost mocking, slow, heavy. Whoever or whatever was up there, they knew I was trapped down here, too scared to move. I felt my grip on the flashlight tighten, my knuckles white with fear. But then the footsteps stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and oppressive, as if the very walls of the lighthouse were holding their breath. I didn't dare move. I barely even breathed. For a few seconds, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it. The presence hadn't left. It was waiting. I thought about the figure outside, standing in the fog. Had it followed me? Was it the same thing haunting the lighthouse, or was there something else here with me? My mind raced with questions I didn't want answers to. I was alone, surrounded by miles of empty sea, and there was no one to call for help. Why did I take this damn job? I muttered under my breath, cursing myself for ever thinking isolation would bring peace. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The air around me grew so cold that my breath came out in short, visible puffs. My skin prickled, every hair on my body standing on end. Then, from the corner of the room, a faint noise, like a whisper. No, not quite a whisper, more like breathing. Something was standing right behind me. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was there, but I knew I had to. Slowly, with my heart pounding in my throat, I turned, the flashlight trembling in my hand. At first, the beam caught nothing but shadows. But then, in the far corner, the darkness shifted. A figure stood there, its outline barely visible, like it was half melded with the shadows. It was taller than any man I'd ever seen, its form hunched and unnatural. My breath hitched in my throat as I took a shaky step backward. "Who are you?" My voice came out weak, barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move, slow and deliberate, each step drawing it closer to me. I could hear my own heart thudding in my ears, drowning out the sound of its approach. My legs refused to cooperate, frozen in place as terror gripped every fiber of my being. Just as it reached the edge of the flashlight's beam, the figure stopped. I don't know why, but I sensed it wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me, at something or someone behind me. I spun around, instinctively shining the light toward the staircase, and that's when I saw her. A woman, pale and drenched in seawater, stood at the base of the stairs. Her eyes, empty, void of any life, locked onto mine. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Just the sound of the ocean, distant and rhythmic, as if it were crashing inside her. Then, with a sudden jolt of clarity, I realized this wasn't the first time I'd seen her. In the old journal I'd found, there was a sketch of a woman, drawn with trembling hands. The final entry spoke of her betrayal, her anger. And now, here she was, the tragic ghost of the past, staring right at me. The figure in the corner vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the woman remained, her eyes locked onto mine. I didn't know what she wanted. Maybe I didn't want to know. But whatever it was, I knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. My name is Jack Oliver. I spent 20 years in the Air Force, most of it stationed overseas. When I retired, I thought I was done with the noise, the chaos, and the constant threat hanging over my head. I wanted quiet, something stable. Maya and I figured that moving to a house near Wright-Patterson would be the perfect start for that. Close enough to what I knew, but far enough from the war zones in my head. At first, it seemed like a good idea. The base was mostly quiet these days. A few active hangars and training exercises, nothing like the buzzing activity I was used to. The house we moved into was old, but it had character. Maya loved the big windows that looked out over the open field. I liked the space, but there was something off about it from the start, something I couldn't quite place. I chalked it up to my own restlessness, the adjustment to civilian life, maybe even the weight of the years I'd spent in service. It was probably nothing, right? But then, I started noticing things. The first time it happened, I was walking the perimeter of the base, a habit I'd picked up from years of patrols. It was late, close to midnight, and the air had that heavy, still quality that always made me uneasy. As I passed one of the old, abandoned hangars, I saw something move inside. It wasn't a shadow, not exactly. It was too solid. I stopped dead in my tracks, squinting to see through the cracked windows. For a second, it looked like a figure, tall, standing in the far corner of the building. But then it was gone, like it had never been there. I didn't tell Maya about it. There wasn't much to say, really. It was probably nothing, a trick of the light, my mind playing games. After all, I'd been through worse. But the feeling stayed with me, that creeping sense of being watched. I told myself it was just old habits, that I was imagining things. But the next night, it happened again. This time, closer. I started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced that something was in the room with us. Maya would stir beside me, ask if I was okay, and I'd lie, telling her it was just a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was the same feeling I had when I was out on a mission, the cold certainty that someone or something was watching, waiting. Only here, there were no enemies, no battlefields, just me, an empty house, and those damn hangars. One morning, I finally broke. Over breakfast, I told Maya I needed to check out the old parts of the base. She laughed at first, said I was probably bored, that I needed a hobby. But there was this look in her eyes, like she knew I wasn't really joking. When I told her about the figures, her smile faltered. "Jack, it's an old base. You're probably just remembering things from the past." She didn't understand. This wasn't the past. It was happening now. I couldn't let it go. I had to find out what was going on, even if it was just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. But part of me, the part I didn't like to admit was there, already knew the truth. Something was wrong at Wright-Patterson, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. I couldn't let it go. The images of those figures moving through the hangars kept gnawing at me, lingering just long enough to make me question everything. Maybe I was losing it. Maya sure seemed to think so, though she was careful not to say it outright. But there was something about the way she looked at me, how her words were always a little too soft, a little too careful, like she was afraid I might break. A week passed, and I found myself drawn to the hangars almost every night. I didn't tell Maya. She wouldn't understand. The base had always been quiet, but now the silence felt heavy, thick, with a tension I couldn't shake. One evening, I stood at the fence, staring at the old buildings, the rusted metal glinting in the last bit of fading light. The air was still, but the unease was there, hanging just out of sight. I could feel it, the way I'd felt things before a mission went sideways. Then, without thinking, I slipped through a gap in the fence. I moved slowly, like I was on patrol again, every sense heightened. My footsteps seemed too loud in the empty space, and the quiet pressed in, making my heart race. When I reached the hangar, I hesitated. The windows were too high to see through, but the door was unlocked. Just standing there, I could already feel the wrongness coming from inside. Something was waiting. I opened the door, half expecting the creak to echo like in the movies, but it was silent, dead. The hangar smelled of old metal and dust, thick enough to make me cough. The shadows inside seemed too deep, like they were swallowing the light from outside. My flashlight cut through the dark, revealing nothing but crates and empty shelves. I knew I should leave. There was no reason to be here, no good that would come from this. But I couldn't move. My feet stayed rooted to the spot, that same nagging instinct telling me to stay alert. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving in the far corner. But this wasn't some illusion. The figure was there, standing still, just like before. It wasn't human, not exactly. Tall, thin, its limbs too long, its shape distorted, as if it didn't quite belong in our world. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt that old fear rising, the kind I hadn't felt since combat, the kind that tightens your chest and makes you think this might be it. I wanted to turn and run, but something in me froze. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, watching me, if that's what it could do. I don't even know if it had eyes, but I could feel it watching. The air grew colder, and my hands shook, the flashlight beam wavering. Then, as if realizing I wasn't leaving, the thing started to move. Slow, deliberate steps, but no sound. Not a single noise as it approached. I should have backed out of the hangar, shut the door, and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, watching it come closer, the pit in my stomach growing deeper. When it was just a few feet away, I finally snapped out of it. I bolted for the door, slamming it behind me, breathing hard as if I just sprinted for miles. I looked back, half expecting it to burst through, but the door stayed shut. I left the base that night, mind racing. There was something more to this place, something that had nothing to do with old military equipment or decommissioned planes. And whatever it was, I wasn't the only one seeing it. I knew I had to talk to someone who'd been on this base longer than me, someone who might actually know what the hell was going on. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, the way it moved, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. It wasn't just a shadow, not some trick of the light. It was real, and I knew it, but explaining that to Maya, to anyone, felt impossible. I stayed quiet the next few days, barely sleeping, my mind running in circles. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The long, twisted limbs, the way it seemed to exist in a space that wasn't entirely ours. My hands would start to sweat, heart racing like I was back in the middle of a firefight. Maya noticed, of course. She wasn't blind to the fact that I was spending less time at home, more time near the base. One night, after I'd come back late again, she cornered me in the kitchen. "Jack, what's going on with you? You've been acting strange for weeks now." Her voice was calm, but there was a layer of worry underneath. I wanted to tell her everything, unload it all, but I didn't even know where to start. "I don't know, Maya," I said, running a hand through my hair. "I've been seeing things. At the base, in the old hangars." The words felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth, even as I said them. Her brow furrowed, and she took a step closer, her eyes searching mine. "What kind of things?" she asked softly, like she was afraid of the answer. I hesitated, trying to find a way to explain it without sounding crazy. "Figures, shadows, but they're not just shadows, they're something else." I could see the confusion on her face, and I couldn't blame her. I was barely making sense to myself. "It's not just me. I can feel it. Something's wrong with that place." She didn't respond right away, just stood there, absorbing what I'd said. Finally, she sighed, placing a hand on my arm. "You've been through a lot, Jack. Maybe it's PTSD or stress. I think you need to talk to someone." The way she looked at me made my chest tighten, like she was afraid I was slipping away. But this wasn't stress. This wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. "It's not that, Maya. I know what I saw." My voice was more desperate than I intended, and I saw her flinch. The conversation ended there, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Maybe I didn't expect her to. That night, as I lay awake next to her, I kept replaying everything in my head, over and over, trying to make sense of it. If Maya wasn't going to understand, there had to be someone who would. Someone who had been on the base long enough to know its secrets. The next day, I drove back to the base, but not to the hangars. I went straight to Captain Anderson's office. He'd been my commanding officer during my last few years of service, and if anyone had answers, it would be him. I waited outside his office, my knee bouncing with impatience, until he finally called me in. He looked older than I remembered, more worn down, like the years had taken something out of him. "Oliver," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What brings you here?" His tone was casual, but his eyes studied me carefully, like he already knew something was off. "I need to ask you something about the base," I started, unsure how to even broach the subject. "About the old hangars." His expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Why the hell are you poking around there, Jack? Those areas have been off limits for a reason." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his stare. "I've been seeing things, sir. Things that don't make sense, and I think they're connected to whatever used to go on in those hangars." His face hardened, the air in the room thick with tension. He didn't speak for a long time, and when he did, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You need to let this go, Oliver. Some things are better left buried." Anderson's words hung in the air like a bad smell, the kind that clings to you long after you've left the room. I sat there, staring at him, waiting for more. He didn't offer any. The silence between us thickened, and I felt my pulse quicken. "What do you mean, buried?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He let out a long breath, looking past me as if considering whether he should say more. "Wright-Patterson's old hangars aren't just abandoned. They were shut down for a reason," muttered, his gaze finally locking onto mine. "During the Cold War, they conducted tests, experiments, things that never saw the light of day, the kind of stuff that gets erased from history." He paused, leaning back in his chair, like the weight of it all had finally landed on him. "The things you're seeing? They aren't new." My stomach turned. "Experiments? What kind of experiments?" I pushed, but he shook his head, lips pressed tight. "I can't tell you everything, but let's just say they were trying to manipulate more than just physics or technology. They were reaching for things beyond human understanding, and sometimes they succeeded." His eyes darkened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He wasn't talking in riddles. He was talking about something real, something dangerous. "What the hell are they?" I asked, my voice rising despite myself. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, the twisted limbs, the way it moved like it wasn't entirely human. "They're the remnants, leftover fragments of whatever those experiments unleashed. Not quite alive, not quite dead, just trapped, and they're always looking for a way out." Anderson's voice had dropped to a near whisper, his face pale. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, every part of me wanting to run, but knowing I couldn't leave this hanging. Why didn't they stop? Why didn't someone shut it down when they realized what they'd done? Anderson looked down at his hands, fingers tapping against the desk in an anxious rhythm. "Because they didn't want to stop, Jack. They were too close, too deep. They wanted to see how far they could push." He shook his head, eyes distant. It didn't end well. I stood up, heart pounding, the room suddenly feeling too small. "You're telling me these things, whatever they are, they're still here? After all these years?" "They never left." As I stepped cautiously into the dimly lit hangar, the air seemed to thicken around me, heavy with the weight of untold secrets. Shadows danced on the walls, elongated and sinister, as if mocking my presence. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the eerie silence. I knew I shouldn't be here, but the need to uncover the truth had consumed me entirely. The documents I had found earlier that day revealed horrifying details. Experiments conducted on human subjects, desperate attempts to breach the barrier between life and death. Images flashed through my mind, faces contorted in agony, voices pleading for release from an existence trapped between worlds. They were here. I could feel them, their presence suffocating, yet strangely compelling. "Jack!" A voice whispered from the darkness, unmistakably familiar, yet tinged with an otherworldly chill. I turned sharply, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. "We're waiting for you." My hands trembled as I clutched the flashlight, its beam faltering against the oppressive gloom. The hangar seemed to stretch infinitely before me, a labyrinth of forgotten horrors and unanswered questions. Maya's face flashed before my eyes, her eyes filled with fear and disbelief as I spiraled deeper into this nightmare. "I have to know," I muttered to myself, the words barely audible over the rising wind outside. But with each step forward, the air grew colder, the shadows more suffocating. The whispers intensified, a chorus of anguished souls urging me to abandon this quest, to leave the past buried where it belonged. A sudden gust of wind extinguished my flashlight, plunging me into total darkness. Panic clawed at my throat as I fumbled for a way out, my mind reeling with visions of what lay just beyond my sight. The hangar echoed with their tortured cries, their desperation seeping into my very bones. And then, in the heart-stopping silence that followed, I saw them, figures materializing from the shadows, their forms twisted and contorted by years of suffering. They moved closer, their presence overwhelming as they reached out, fingers brushing against my skin with an icy touch. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears mingling with the sweat on my face. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But the entities showed no mercy, their grip tightening around me as they pulled me further into their world. In that moment of horrifying clarity, I realized the truth. They were not just haunting this place, they were a part of me, tethered by the same darkness that had consumed them. As their whispers grew louder, merging with my own frantic thoughts, I knew what I had to do. With trembling hands, I tore at the documents, shredding them into pieces and scattering them to the wind. The entities recoiled, their screams piercing the night as their hold on me began to weaken. "I'm sorry," I repeated, my voice hoarse with grief and exhaustion. "Something shouldn't be uncovered." And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The hangar fell silent once more, the echoes of their torment fading into the stillness. I sank to my knees, the weight of what I had witnessed crushing me with a terrible finality. Outside, Maya waited, her silhouette framed against the moonlit sky. She approached slowly, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. Without a word, she helped me to my feet, leading me away from the hangar and the darkness that had nearly consumed me. As we walked into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that some part of them still lingered, waiting for another unsuspecting soul to stumble upon their restless spirits. And though I had silenced their voices, I knew that their story would haunt me for the rest of my days, a reminder of the horrors hidden within the shadows of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The boat ride out to Fort Jefferson felt longer than I remembered. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the water, and every ripple seemed to echo in the stillness. I could feel the unease creeping up my spine, the same sensation I had tried to bury for years. I stared at the massive stone walls in the distance, their silhouette looming on the horizon, and swallowed hard. Coming back here was a mistake. Kayla, sitting beside me, was bubbling with excitement. "I've been waiting for this forever, Adam. This place is legendary for paranormal activity. The history alone, Civil War soldiers, sailors lost at sea. You have no idea how much I've read about it." She was all energy, her eyes shining with the kind of curiosity that used to drive her research. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach tightened. I had an idea, all right. I'd been here before. I hadn't told her everything, about what happened the last time, how during my deployment, something happened in those dark corridors, something that still woke me up at night, drenched in cold sweat. There were things you just didn't talk about, things that clung to you like a shadow long after you'd left the battlefield. But Kayla, she thought this was some kind of adventure, a ghost hunt. She didn't understand. Not really. The boat docked, and as we stepped off, the wind hit me. It wasn't strong, just a light breeze, but it carried something with it. A memory. The same cold, salty air that had wrapped around me the first time I set foot here, back when everything felt off but explainable. This time, though, the air seemed heavier, thicker. It clung to my skin, pressing down on me, as if the fort itself was aware of my return. "Adam, you okay?" Kayla was already heading up the path, turning to look back at me with a slight frown. I forced a smile and followed her, trying to shake the feeling crawling under my skin. The fort's massive entrance loomed ahead, its walls pockmarked and ancient, like it had been standing for far too long. The closer we got, the more I could feel that same gnawing dread. The last time I walked through those doors, I came out a different person. And now, I was willingly stepping back inside. As we crossed the threshold, it felt like stepping into another world. The temperature dropped almost immediately, the cool air of the stone corridors swallowing us whole. My footsteps echoed, sharp and hollow, the sound bouncing off the walls like a distant memory. Kayla was busy setting up her equipment, the glow of her enthusiasm almost palpable. But I could already feel the weight of the place settling on my chest, the familiar pressure that had nothing to do with the atmosphere and everything to do with what was waiting in the shadows. I hadn't been here in years, but it was all coming back. The darkness, the whispers that shouldn't have been there, and the sensation of being watched. Always watched. I glanced down the hallway, half expecting to see something move in the periphery of my vision, but it was just empty stone and silence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fort remembered me, and whatever haunted it was just waiting for me to make the first move. Kayla's footsteps echoed as she moved deeper into the fort, her voice drifting back to me, excited, animated. She was already talking about setting up cameras, EMF readers, all her ghost hunting gear that I barely understood. But I wasn't paying attention. My eyes kept tracing the cracks in the stone walls, the way the light seemed to die before it could reach too far down the corridor. It was familiar, too familiar. The last time I'd walked these halls, I was in uniform. We were stationed here for a few weeks, doing routine checks and maintenance. Nothing out of the ordinary, at least that's what it was supposed to be. But it wasn't long before the strangeness started. Back then, it felt subtle at first, like the fort itself was breathing. The air, the walls, the way the sound carried, it was wrong somehow. None of us talked about it, not directly, but I knew I wasn't the only one who felt it. You could see it in the guys' faces, the way we all slept less, our nerves on edge. I still remember the night that changed everything. One of the guys, Brenner, swore he saw a figure walking the battlements, a man in an old Civil War uniform. We laughed it off, told him it was probably just a trick of the light, the isolation getting to him. But when I went up there later, I saw something too. Just a glimpse out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, moving too deliberately to be an illusion. I never mentioned it, but from that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were never really alone in this place. It felt like eyes were always watching from the dark corners. Now, standing here again, I felt it creeping back, the heaviness in my chest, the way my skin prickled like I was being watched. I wanted to tell Kayla to pack it up, to get out before we stirred something that didn't want to be found. But I couldn't. She wouldn't understand. She was too focused, too determined to find proof of the paranormal. I'd seen that look in her eyes before, the one that said she was willing to go further than anyone else to get her answers. And now, I was stuck in it with her. "Adam, come look at this," Kayla called from up ahead, her voice bouncing off the stone walls. I followed the sound, the floor cold beneath my boots. As I turned the corner, I found her kneeling by an old iron door, the rust thick on its surface, like it hadn't been opened in decades. She had her hand resting on it, her camera aimed at the narrow slit in the center where the light barely seeped through. "This is it," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "I can feel it." I couldn't feel anything except the growing unease twisting in my gut. "Kayla, maybe we shouldn't." I trailed off, my eyes drawn to the slit in the door. There was something about the darkness on the other side, something that felt alive. She ignored me, already setting up her equipment, her face lit with excitement. But I couldn't shake the feeling that opening that door would be a mistake. A big one. Because whatever was behind it, whatever had been waiting all these years, wasn't ready to let us go. Not yet. Kayla twisted the rusted handle, and the iron door groaned like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. The sound crawled up my spine, thick and sharp, as though the fort itself was protesting. The air that spilled out from the crack was cold, colder than it should have been for this time of year. Colder than anything that felt right. She didn't notice. She was too focused on whatever lay beyond, too eager to document her findings. "Wait, Kayla," I muttered, stepping forward, my hand reaching out to stop her. I wasn't sure why. It wasn't like we hadn't opened other doors in this place already, but this one felt different. Something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She paused, glancing at me with that impatient look she always gave when she thought I was being overprotective. "It's fine, Adam," she said, her voice steady. "Look, it's just another room." She pushed the door fully open, and the rusty hinges gave way, revealing the dark space inside. But it wasn't just another room. The walls were black with age, and the floor was covered in layers of dust so thick it muffled every sound. There was a strange stillness to the place, like it had been sealed away from time itself. Kayla stepped in, her camera already in hand, but I hesitated. My instincts were screaming at me to pull her back, to leave before we made things worse. "I've been here before," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it literally or if the place just felt familiar. It was like déjà vu, but deeper, more unsettling. I didn't remember this room, but something in me did. The room felt wrong. I don't know how else to explain it. It was like walking into a space that wasn't meant for us, a place that hadn't seen light in far too long. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. Kayla was oblivious, already filming, narrating the layout of the room, the strange symbols carved into the stone. But I wasn't listening to her. My focus was on the shadows, the way they clung to the edges of the walls, too thick for the weak light from her flashlight. Something moved. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't obvious, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear straight through me. I turned my head slowly, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. I forced myself to breathe, trying to shake it off, but I knew what I'd seen. Or rather, I knew what I hadn't seen, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. "Kayla, we need to go," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. She ignored me, too engrossed in her investigation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Not from the corners, but from the very walls themselves. Like the fort was alive, and we were intruding on something that should have been left buried. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, just behind me. Not a breeze, not the rustle of fabric, a voice. Clear as day, yet barely more than a breath. It said my name. The whisper froze me in place. I knew I hadn't imagined it, couldn't have. My name had come from somewhere, someone behind me. The room felt colder now, the air thick, making it harder to breathe. I swallowed hard, turning slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last. But when I faced the door, there was nothing. Just the dark hallway we had come through, empty and silent. The kind of silence that felt too perfect, too deliberate, as if it were hiding something just beyond what I could see. I wanted to call out to Kayla, tell her we needed to leave, but my voice wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, like I was holding something back. Or maybe something was holding me back. I kept scanning the shadows, half expecting to see a face, an outline, something that could explain the voice. But all I saw were the stone walls and the dust swirling lazily in the dim light of Kayla's flashlight. She was still talking, still filming, completely oblivious to the shift in the room's atmosphere. "Adam, look at these markings," she said, crouching down to trace her fingers over the rough carvings in the wall. Her voice echoed too loudly, breaking the oppressive silence, and for a second, it sounded wrong, like it didn't belong in this space. I watched her for a moment, my body tense, trying to shake the feeling that had settled over me. I needed to snap out of it. This was just an old fort, a relic from another time. We weren't in any danger, but the whisper hadn't been my imagination. "Kayla, stop!" The words came out harsher than I intended, but she didn't even look up. "Kayla!" I stepped closer, grabbing her arm. The moment I touched her, something shifted. The temperature plummeted, the cold so sudden and intense that I could see my breath clouding in front of me. Kayla froze, her eyes wide as she looked up at me, the color draining from her face. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I followed her gaze. There, just behind us in the far corner, the shadows seemed to move. No, it wasn't the shadows. It was something in the shadows. A figure, barely visible but unmistakable, standing impossibly still, as if it had been there all along, watching us. My stomach dropped, and every instinct screamed at me to move, to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. "Adam," Kayla's voice cracked. Her hand tightened around my wrist, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. I wanted to protect her, to pull her out of that room, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, its presence heavy, suffocating. I felt that same whisper crawl up my spine, the one that had spoken my name earlier. This time, it was clearer, louder, and it wasn't just one voice, it was many. We needed to leave. Now. I yanked Kayla to her feet, my heart hammering in my chest as I turned toward the door. But the figure didn't follow. It just watched, its outline barely distinguishable in the darkness, but enough to leave a mark in my mind that I knew I wouldn't forget. We stumbled out of the room, my hand gripping Kayla's as we rushed down the corridor, the air still freezing, the walls pressing in on us like they were trying to keep us there. We ran, Kayla gripping my arm as we stumbled through the dark corridors, the walls seeming to close in on us. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Every step echoed back at me, each one feeling slower, heavier, like the fort didn't want us to leave. Kayla hadn't said a word since we left that room, and I didn't dare look back. I didn't have to. I could still feel the figure's eyes on me, the weight of its presence pressing against my back. The air was thick, cold, and the shadows along the walls seemed to ripple like something was moving just beyond our sight. My legs burned with each step, but the fear was stronger than the pain. I didn't care where we were going, just that we were getting as far away from whatever was back there as we could. I wasn't sure how long we ran before Kayla finally stopped, gasping for breath. She leaned against the stone wall, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear I'd never seen in her before. What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her hand shook as she brushed her hair out of her face, and I could see the panic in her eyes, the confusion. This was the first time she wasn't in control, the first time the rational explanations she loved didn't apply. I didn't have an answer. I could barely think straight. My mind kept replaying that moment in the room, the whisper of my name, the figure standing there, still and watching. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "But it's real. It's not just a story, not just rumors. Something's here." Kayla shook her head, trying to steady herself. "No, it's gotta be something else. Maybe it's..." She stopped herself, but I knew what she was thinking. A trick of the light, a reflection, something she could explain away. But there was no denying what we'd seen, what I'd felt. There was something wrong with this place, something far beyond what either of us could comprehend. I moved closer to her, lowering my voice. "Kayla, we have to go. Now. This isn't a game. This place, it doesn't want us here." The words tasted bitter coming out, as if speaking them made it all too real. I had come back to face the ghosts of my past. But now I realized there were things here much older, much darker than anything I could have imagined. And they weren't just haunting the fort. They were alive, waiting. She nodded, her confidence cracked, but still holding on to some hope that we could leave and put this behind us. We turned down another corridor, the exit not far, when I felt it again, that cold, biting sensation. Not just the air this time, but something brushing against the back of my neck. My breath hitched, and I froze. Kayla kept walking a few steps ahead, unaware, her back turned. I didn't want to turn around. Everything in me told me not to, but the pull was too strong. I slowly turned my head, the stone walls stretching out behind us, empty. But then, the whisper, soft, almost gentle, but unmistakable. My name. I felt my chest tighten, and when I blinked, I saw it, the same figure, standing further down the hall. Only this time, it was closer. Close enough that I could see the outline of its face, the hollow eyes staring straight at me, empty and endless. And then I understood. It hadn't been watching me this whole time. It had been waiting. The realization hit me hard, a cold weight settling deep in my gut. This thing wasn't tied to the fort. It was tied to me. All those years ago, something had latched on, something I'd brought back with me, and now it was claiming what it had been waiting for. There was no escaping it. When Rebecca and I arrived at the cabin, it felt like we were stepping into another world. Emerald Bay stretched out before us, the water dark and still, like it was holding its breath. The air was heavy, quiet, almost too quiet, if I'm being honest. The cabin itself, Cabin 13, was tucked away from everything. It was small, just big enough for the two of us, with weathered wood siding and a porch that creaked when you walked on it. The kind of place that should feel peaceful, but instead, it felt off. I didn't mention it to Rebecca. She was excited, smiling as she unpacked our things, already talking about taking the kayak out in the morning. I tried to match her enthusiasm, but something in my gut kept nagging at me. Years in the army taught me to trust my instincts, and they were screaming that something wasn't right. But maybe that was just me being paranoid. After everything I'd been through, maybe I was the one who needed to calm down. Isn't this place great? Rebecca's voice cut through my thoughts as she tossed a blanket onto the couch. She had that spark in her eyes, the one I loved. Yeah, it's perfect, I lied. My voice came out too flat, too rehearsed. She didn't notice, or maybe she didn't want to. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Rebecca was out cold beside me, but I just stared up at the ceiling, watching shadows shift in the moonlight. The walls felt too close, the bed too small. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder in the dark. My mind kept going back to the long drive through the woods, the narrow dirt road that led us here. It felt like we'd left civilization behind miles ago. Too far, maybe. Around midnight, I got up, careful not to wake Rebecca. I needed air. The cool breeze off the lake hit my face as I stepped out onto the porch. Everything was still. No wind, no animals, just nothing. It was unsettling, like the whole world had paused. I leaned on the railing, looking out at the water, and then I heard it. A soft click, like a door closing behind me. I turned, half expecting to see Rebecca standing there, but the door was shut, the cabin dark. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood there for a minute, listening, but nothing happened. Maybe it was just the wind. I was tired. That had to be it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something just out of sight, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I told myself to get it together. This was supposed to be a vacation, not some nightmare. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Rebecca seemed fine, though, moving around the kitchen, humming to herself while she made coffee. I sat at the table, staring out the window. The lake looked different in the daylight, less mysterious, but that didn't make me feel any better. I hadn't mentioned what happened the night before. It was probably nothing anyway, right? Still, my mind kept going back to that sound, a door closing on its own. I wasn't imagining it. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked, setting a cup in front of me. Her smile faded as she saw my face. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just didn't sleep well." I tried to sound casual, but the words felt forced. She frowned but didn't push it. We'd been together long enough for her to know when I needed space. After breakfast, we decided to take the kayak out, like she'd wanted. The water was calm, the kind of stillness that usually makes you feel at peace. But all I felt was a growing unease. I kept scanning the tree line, watching for something. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but it was like my body was on high alert. I couldn't relax. "You're not enjoying this, are you?" Rebecca asked, her voice cutting through the silence as we paddled. "I am," I lied again, gripping the oar a little too tightly. "It's just, I don't know. Something about this place doesn't sit right with me." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "It's just because it's quiet. You're used to the noise of the city." Maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't built for peace anymore. But it wasn't just the quiet. It was the way the air felt heavier out here, like the world was pressing in on us. I didn't say anything else, though. No point in ruining her trip with my paranoia. That night, things got worse. I woke up to a thud, the kind of sound that jolts you straight out of sleep. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, but Rebecca didn't stir. I listened for a moment, holding my breath, waiting for it to happen again. And then it did. Another thud, this time louder, like something heavy falling over. "Rebecca," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. "Did you hear that?" She groaned, half asleep. "What are you talking about?" "That sound. Something's in the cabin." She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked around. "Brian, there's nothing here. It's an old cabin. It's probably just settling." But I knew better. That wasn't the sound of an old cabin creaking. Something had moved. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and slipped out of bed, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body on edge. Rebecca followed, less convinced but clearly starting to pick up on my anxiety. I shone the light down the hallway, moving slowly toward the living room. The beam swept across the floor, the furniture, everything was where it should be. And then I saw it, the front door. It was wide open. I froze when I saw the door hanging open, the cool night air creeping into the cabin. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but the place was too isolated for that. No one had followed us here. At least, no one should have. My pulse quickened, and I felt Rebecca's hand on my arm, her fingers tightening. "Brian," she whispered, her voice shaking now. She wasn't laughing it off anymore. "I'll check it out," I muttered, my throat dry. I didn't want to admit how rattled I was. This was supposed to be a quiet getaway, just the two of us, but everything felt wrong now. I stepped forward, the floor creaking under my weight, and shone the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, but nothing moved. The porch was empty. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. But that wasn't the part that scared me. What scared me was that I knew I had locked the door before we went to bed. I was sure of it. My hand had been on the latch, the lock clicking into place. There was no way it just opened on its own. Something or someone had opened it. "Do you think it's an animal?" Rebecca's voice broke the silence. I didn't answer. I didn't want to tell her what I really thought. I didn't want to admit that there was no logical explanation for any of this. The heavy thuds in the night, the door swinging wide open, the sense that we weren't alone, none of it made sense. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch, the wood cold under my feet. I scanned the area, the light flickering over the trees and down toward the lake. Still nothing. I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, but every instinct screamed that we needed to leave. Get back in the car, drive away, and never come back. But I couldn't do that. Not yet. Not until I knew what was happening. Rebecca was still inside, waiting for me, trusting me to protect her. I had to keep it together. I turned back to the cabin, the door still hanging open behind me. Something caught my eye. A shape, low to the ground, darting past the edge of the trees. It was fast, too fast to make out clearly, but it was there. I wasn't imagining it. My stomach dropped. Whatever it wasn't human. I felt the cold weight of fear settle in my chest, heavier than before. Whatever I had seen, it wasn't done with us. Back inside the cabin, the air felt heavier than before, almost suffocating. I locked the door again, my hands shaking. Rebecca was still on edge, her face pale as she looked around the room. She tried to stay calm, but her anxiety was palpable. I could see it in her eyes. "What do you think is going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced nervously toward the darkened windows, as if expecting something to appear. "I don't know," I admitted. My voice sounded distant, even to me. I didn't want to admit how scared I was. "But I'm going to find out. Stay here." Rebecca nodded, though she looked far from reassured. I grabbed the flashlight and a baseball bat from the closet, something to give me a semblance of control. The sound of the bat against my hand was oddly comforting, a small anchor in the sea of uncertainty. I started with the living room, sweeping the light across every shadow, every corner. The furniture was in place. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the longer I searched, the more the silence pressed in on me. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. I moved methodically, checking each room, each closet, all the while feeling the weight of Rebecca's eyes on my back. In the bathroom, I noticed something strange, a small circular scratch on the mirror, almost like a fingertip pressed against it. I wiped it with a cloth, but it reappeared, clear and unmistakable. It didn't make sense. The mirror wasn't old enough to have scratches like that. It was as though something had been trying to get my attention, but why? I walked back to the living room and found Rebecca standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. I approached her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She jumped slightly, then turned to me with wide eyes. There was something outside. I thought I saw a figure, but when I looked again, it was gone. I felt a chill run down my spine. Her description matched what I had seen earlier. I tried to remain calm, though the fear gnawed at me. "We need to figure out what's happening," I said, though I wasn't sure how. There must be an explanation. We decided to go outside together to look for any sign of what might be causing these disturbances. The porch light cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. I moved slowly, every creak of the wood loud in the oppressive silence. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and the still water of the lake. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was waiting just beyond the edge of the light. The longer we stayed, the more the fear crept in, tightening around us like a noose. I glanced at Rebecca, her face illuminated by the dim light, and saw the same fear reflected in her eyes. "Maybe it's time we consider leaving," I suggested, though I hated the idea of abandoning this place. There was something here, something I needed to understand. But if it meant keeping Rebecca safe, I would have to find a way to face my fears. Rebecca and I sat in silence after our brief outdoor search. The cabin felt more oppressive than ever, each creak and groan of the old wood echoing through the stillness. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. I felt like I was on the edge of a precipice, and every time I looked over, I saw something darker and more terrifying. "Maybe we should really think about leaving," Rebecca said, her voice barely a whisper. I could see the tremor in her hands as she held the mug of coffee she had brewed earlier. The comforting warmth of the beverage did nothing to chase away the cold creeping into our bones. "I want to, but..." I trailed off, struggling to put my thoughts into words. "There's something here, something we need to understand before we just run away." Rebecca looked at me with fear-filled eyes. "What if there's nothing to understand? What if it's just evil?" Her words hit me harder than I expected. I could feel the weight of her fear pressing on me, but my mind was already set on uncovering whatever dark secret this cabin held. I needed to know why this place felt so wrong, why the air seemed to thicken with every passing hour. I decided to search the cabin one more time, hoping that I'd miss something, anything that could explain the strange occurrences. As I moved through the rooms, flashlight in hand, I noticed a small door at the back of the closet in the bedroom, one I hadn't seen before. The door was narrow, almost like a service hatch, and it was slightly ajar. I pulled it open slowly, revealing a cramped space filled with old military equipment, dust-covered uniforms, maps, and a wooden box. My heart skipped a beat as I carefully opened the box. Inside were faded photographs of soldiers, and at the bottom, a stack of letters bound with a fraying ribbon. The letters were addressed to someone named Eleanor, but their content was illegible due to age. I heard Rebecca's footsteps behind me and turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Brian, what is it?" Before I could respond, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of something or someone scraping against the walls. We both jumped, my flashlight flickering as I swung it toward the noise. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. "We need to get out now," Rebecca urged, her voice rising in panic. But as we hurried to the door, I saw it, a shadow moving just beyond the reach of the flashlight. It was tall, thin, and seemed to flicker like a flame in the corner of my eye. In a rush of adrenaline, I yanked the door open and shoved Rebecca ahead of me. We raced toward the car, but as we reached the driveway, I glanced back at the cabin. The windows were dark, but a sense of something watching us lingered in the air. We sped down the dirt road, Rebecca's breathing fast and shallow beside me. My heart was pounding, and the image of that shadow remained burned in my mind. The letters, the photographs, the unease, it all pointed to something terrible hidden in the cabin's past. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of the horror that lurked there. The darkness wasn't just in the cabin. It was a part of the land, of the secrets buried deep within it. And even as we escaped, I knew that the shadows would follow, creeping into the corners of my mind, reminding me of the darkness that had never truly let us go. I'm Connor Williams, a retired firefighter, and this is the story of how a fresh start turned into a waking nightmare. After years of facing down flames and saving lives, I thought retirement would be a relief. My wife Jasmine and I had decided to settle into a newly renovated loft in the Woolworth building, where I'd once fought a devastating fire. It seemed like a good idea, a way to connect with my past while embracing a new chapter. But the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run. The first few nights in the loft were supposed to be about getting used to our new surroundings. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things that unsettled me. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty rooms when I was alone. Jasmine dismissed it as the quirks of an old building, but I knew something was wrong. The building had a history that clung to its walls like smoke. One evening, I was trying to relax in the living room when a chill swept through the room. I glanced around, but everything seemed normal. The furniture was arranged just as we'd left it, and the only light came from the lamp beside me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Flames flickering in the darkness, rising from the floor as if the fire was still burning. My heart raced, and I tried to shake off the image, but it persisted. "Connor, are you okay?" Jasmine's voice broke through my panic. I hadn't even heard her come in. I turned to her, my face probably pale. "I'm fine," I said, though I knew my tone betrayed me. "Just had a flashback. I think I need to get some air." Jasmine nodded, her concern evident. I went out to the balcony, hoping the cool night air would clear my mind. The city below looked calm, almost serene. But as I looked out, I felt a weight pressing on my chest, as if the very air was thick with dread. The memories of that fire, the screams and the smoke, they were back, more vivid than ever. That's when I decided I needed help. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something more sinister was at play. It wasn't just PTSD, it felt like the building itself was haunted by something. I reached out to Dr. Foster, a retired military psychiatrist with experience in dealing with severe trauma. I hoped he could help me separate the past from the present, but a nagging voice in my head wondered if the Woolworth building had more secrets than I realized. The terror I felt wasn't just in my mind, it was as if the building was alive, remembering the horrors it had witnessed. Seeing Dr. Foster for the first time was both a relief and a source of apprehension. His office was filled with an assortment of books and calming decor, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I sat across from him, trying to steady my breathing. The room's silence was almost too loud, filled with the weight of unspoken fears. "How long have you been experiencing these visions?" Dr. Foster asked, his voice gentle but probing. His calm demeanor made me feel as though I was about to open a door I wasn't sure I wanted to. "Since we moved into the loft," I began, my voice wavering. "It's like the fire's still here, in the walls, in the air. I see flames even when I know they aren't real." Dr. Foster nodded, jotting down notes. "And how does this make you feel?" I stared at my hands, which were clasped tightly in my lap. "It's not just the visions. It's like there's this constant weight pressing down on me. Every time I try to relax, the fire comes back, but worse, I feel like I'm trapped in it again." He leaned back, studying me with a thoughtful expression. Trauma can manifest in various ways, especially in environments connected to the traumatic event. It's possible that the loft is triggering these memories. I felt a flicker of doubt. But what if it's more than that? What if there's something in the building? Dr. Foster's eyes met mine. "You're not alone in feeling this way. Many people have reported similar experiences in buildings with traumatic histories. We need to understand your memories more deeply and see if there's a pattern or something else influencing your perceptions." Over the next few weeks, our sessions became a regular part of my routine. We delved into my past, focusing on the fire at the Woolworth building. Dr. Foster used various techniques to help me explore my memories, but the more I uncovered, the more unsettling things became. I would recount the events of that day, the heat, the smoke, the frantic cries for help, and each time it felt like I was reliving it all over again. During one session, Dr. Foster played back a recording of our previous discussions. Listening to the tape, I noticed a recurring detail I hadn't paid much attention to before. Each time I described the fire, there were moments when I mentioned hearing a strange, rhythmic sound beneath the roar of the flames. It was almost as if something else was burning, something more sinister. "Do you think these sounds mean something?" I asked, my voice trembling. Dr. Foster's expression turned serious. "It's possible. We may need to investigate further, Not just your memories, but the building's history as well. There might be a connection between the fire and other events tied to the Woolworth building. As I left Dr. Foster's office, I felt a mix of dread and determination. The idea of digging into the building's past was both frightening and necessary. If the loft was holding on to something, I needed to uncover it before it consumed me completely. Dr. Foster and I spent days combing through records about the Woolworth building. We dug into its history, looking for anything that might explain the disturbing phenomena I'd been experiencing. I was hoping for answers, but finding only fragments and rumors. Jasmine helped as much as she could, but the more we uncovered, the more unsettled I became. One evening, while I was going through old newspapers and city archives, Jasmine found an article about an accident in the building from the 1930s. It mentioned an explosion in the basement that had claimed several lives. The report was vague, almost as if it was hiding something. The words mysterious fire and unexplained damage stood out to me, each phrase fueling my anxiety. "Connor, this might be something," Jasmine said, holding up the newspaper. "Look at this." I glanced at the article, my stomach tightening. An explosion in the basement? I don't remember hearing anything about this before. Jasmine nodded. I did some more digging and found similar reports from other sources. It seems like there were multiple incidents over the years that didn't add up. It's like the building has a dark history no one wants to talk about. The weight of her words sank in. My heart raced as I thought about the strange sounds I'd heard in the loft. The rhythmic thumping that seemed to pulse through the building like a heartbeat. Could these past incidents be connected? Was the building itself haunted, or was something more sinister at play? Dr. Foster suggested that we investigate the basement, where the explosion had occurred. Despite my reservations, I agreed. I needed to know if there was a connection between the building's dark past and my current experiences. The basement was a labyrinth of old storage rooms and forgotten spaces, each shadow seeming to harbor its own secrets. As we descended into the dimly lit basement, the air grew colder. The light from our flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The silence was almost oppressive, punctuated only by the faint hum of the building's old machinery. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of cold air felt like a sign. Suddenly, I heard it again, the rhythmic sound I had noticed before. It seemed to be coming from behind a wall. My pulse quickened. I tapped on the wall, listening for any hollow spaces. Dr. Foster looked at me, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "What do you think it is?" he asked. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, "but it feels like we're getting closer to the truth. Whatever happened here, it's still echoing through these walls." The tension was unbearable. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move on its own. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. The building's past was coming back to confront us, and I couldn't escape the growing dread that the worst was yet to come. We pushed deeper into the basement, our flashlights illuminating old crates and cobweb-covered machinery. The rhythmic sound grew louder, reverberating through the narrow hallways. Each pulse felt like a heartbeat, drumming against my chest. I turned to Dr. Foster, trying to mask my unease. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What if we find something we're not ready for?" He looked back at me, his brow furrowed. "We won't know until we investigate. Remember, ignoring this could haunt you more than anything we find here." His words struck a chord. The truth was, I couldn't ignore the visions. Each night, I saw the flames engulfing my colleagues, their faces twisted in pain, pleading for help that I couldn't provide. I pushed those memories aside, focusing on the present. We reached a door at the end of the hall, its paint peeling and hinges rusted. The sound pulsed behind it, almost beckoning us closer. I placed my hand on the cold metal handle, my heart racing. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, glancing back at Dr. Foster. He nodded, his eyes wide with anticipation. The noise intensified, echoing like a distant siren. I hesitated, then turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark and damp, the air thick with dust. As we stepped inside, my flashlight caught the remnants of an old storage area. Shelves lined the walls, filled with forgotten items. But it wasn't the clutter that seized my attention. It was the wall opposite us, marred with charred marks, evidence of a past fire. "Connor," Dr. Foster said, stepping closer to the wall. "Look at this." My breath caught in my throat. The patterns resembled claw marks, jagged and uneven. A chill raced down my spine. "What happened here?" I murmured, memories of the Woolworth fire flooding back. The heat, the chaos, the screams of my fellow firefighters. Dr. Foster examined the wall, his expression grave. "This isn't just damage from an accident. It feels intentional, like something was trying to break free." I shuddered at the thought. Break free? From what? As if in answer, the rhythmic noise crescendoed, resonating through the room. I stepped back, my pulse pounding in my ears. A shadow flickered at the corner of my vision. "Did you see that?" I gasped, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Dr. Foster turned, his face pale. "We need to get out of here, Connor." But before we could move, the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. My flashlight sputtered and died, leaving us enveloped in a heavy silence. The air grew colder, and I could feel the presence closing in, thick and suffocating. My mind raced as I fumbled for the door, panic rising in my throat. We had crossed a line, and I feared whatever lurked in the shadows was not ready to let us go. I scrambled for the door, my heart hammering. The pitch-black room seemed to close in around us. The rhythmic noise had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence that made my skin crawl. I could barely make out Dr. Foster's silhouette in the dim light of our dying flashlights. "Connor, hurry!" he urged, his voice strained. I yanked on the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as I pushed harder, my knuckles white from the effort. The cold air pressed in, heavier than before. I could feel an almost palpable sense of dread growing around us. "Why won't it open?" I shouted, desperation clear in my voice. I hammered on the door with my fists. Dr. Foster joined me, his breathing ragged. "We must have missed something. Look around. Find another way out." As we fumbled in the dark, a chilling breeze swept through the room. It was as though the walls themselves were breathing. I spotted a faint glow coming from a crack in the wall, the same wall with the claw marks. "Connor, over here!" Dr. Foster called. "There's a light." I moved towards the crack, the glow growing stronger as I approached. My hands shook as I examined the fissure. It was small, but enough for me to see an old rusted latch hidden behind debris. "Help me with this," I said, struggling to pull the latch free. Dr. Foster grabbed the other side, and together we managed to pry it open. A narrow passage revealed itself, just wide enough for us to squeeze through. We crawled through the passage, my claustrophobia making every inch feel like a battle. The passage led to a stairwell, and I practically leaped up the steps, desperation fueling my ascent. The oppressive darkness seemed to press against me, a constant reminder of the horror we had just escaped. When we finally emerged into the main floor of the building, the familiar surroundings offered little comfort. The building's old charm now felt twisted and alien. Jasmine was waiting for us, her face pale with worry. "Connor, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We found something," I said, catching my breath. "Something that links the fire to the building's history." Dr. Foster nodded, his face ashen. "We need to investigate further. There's more to this place than we realized." As we regrouped, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The presence we'd felt in the basement was still there, lurking. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the air was thick with a malevolent energy. In the days that followed, the visions grew more intense. I saw faces in the flames, their eyes pleading for justice. The more I learned about the building, the more it seemed to want to hide its secrets. I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever was haunting us was just beginning to reveal itself. The fire wasn't just a tragedy. It was part of something much darker, something that still clung to the very walls of the Woolworth building. The real nightmare had only just begun.